actually going to try and talk a bit about this idea of systemic change and try to argue a little bit with Mika on some of the points he made. I was a little surprised to be so depressed by his talk. Will the internet make the world a better place? I think we all know that both good and really bad things happen online. And it's often said that the internet mirrors what happens in the real world, both the good and the bad. But we also know that the internet facilitates a type of thinking and a way of acting and organizing, shopping, changing, disrupting. And I think what we have at this stage in time is a kind of chicken and egg conundrum. You know, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Will the world change the internet before the internet changes the world? Or is it going to be the other way around? I think the one thing that makes me hopeful is that there seems to be this global collective memory of how the web is used and how best practices seem to be built on top of each other across borders, across time. Global Voices, which is the network that I help lead, is a large community of bloggers, translators, people who are using online media in multiple ways to try and explain their world or their local situation to the world. So in some ways we're a news organization that reports on what's happening via social media, and in other ways we're kind of an incubator for digital activism and people who do things with the internet in their societies, whether it's transparency or data or even, you know, activities during revolutions. I think when I talk about this collective memory, a really clear example of it is how the internet is used in protest movements and uprisings around the world. You can see how people become more sophisticated in their use of hashtags, of live video, donation drives, fact-checking, reporting, many of the things that people in this room are active in. You see gradually how people get a greater understanding for the way that media works and how democracy works, and how the levers of power can be influenced by citizens. In Syria, you had live streaming video activists who keep logs of their videos because they know that the Egyptians didn't do it and they want to do it better. They know it can be useful documentation for, let's say, a truth commission or a trial someday in the future. In Ukraine, Yanukovych Leaks makes use of a whole set of tools and methods that have been tried previously in other contexts. Not to mention the use of the word leaks, as in WikiLeaks, which has become synonymous with the idea of dumping important information online and allowing people to make sense of it themselves. So all this sharing of knowledge of best practices in terms of citizen activity and citizen media, it doesn't happen automatically. There are people who do it very with purpose. There are people who do this like PDF, like Global Voices, like many of the individuals in the room. And sometimes it's just, an individual on Twitter, maybe a programmer who sees something is happening in Iran and thinks of a way to help and emails people. There are people who are working together across borders to try and solve different problems that they see can be resolved with technology. I think, so the example of how people are using technology in these protests and uprisings and these kind of heated moments of political upheaval are a clear example, but a more subtle and difficult thing to document is how the concept of citizenship is changing around the world. And I really think that it is. Several years ago, we had this article on Global Voices from Sudan where we quoted somebody who said, I haven't got the exact words, but it was something along the lines of, we have Facebook now. We're not cut off from the world. We know what a society is supposed to look like. Like, don't think we're fools. We're connected to the internet now. The internet is a window on the world, both the good and the bad, but also the promise of what can be achieved. It does give people a lot of hope in situations that seem very bleak. This sense of entitlement or the sense of empowerment that the internet has given us, I believe, is getting much stronger all over the world. And you see it in the kind of demands that people make of their governments, the kind of initiatives that they develop themselves in non-political arenas as well as political arenas. And you see it in the way that they've robbed the mass media of their monopoly on communication. You see a greater understanding of bureaucracy, of the hypocrisy of government, of propaganda. And I think you have to go pretty far in the world, like in the wilderness, to find somebody who has neither SMS nor email nor the web to give them a different perspective of what's going on. It's a time where old ideologies are getting weaker and where we have the capacity to see things beyond black and white. I think this in itself bodes for change in politics, and it's already enabled the birth of numerous political parties, political participation methods. It's not that these things didn't happen in the past. There's always been a sort of a gradual development, but I think as with everything related to the disruptive force of the internet, it has to do with the speed and the intensity with which this is happening. I think Occupy was a really exciting movement that people have kind of forgotten because it didn't lead to anything concrete. But many of the activists who came together in Occupy are still doing things to improve their society. It created a whole new generation of tech-savvy grassroots knowledge that gets passed along, like the example that Mika shared with Lumio, but there are numerous others at the grassroots level in several different countries. People never really argue whether social media helped Occupy or not, the way that people argue about whether social media helped the revolution in Egypt or not. And I think it has to do with our impatience for seeing change that comes from the internet. I think despite all the speed that we do have, I think we need to be more patient in our assessment of what's working or not. Right now, governments in democracies and in dictatorships, they react extremely violently to systemic challenges that citizens bring to them. And this can be either through crackdowns in protests where they shoot people, or through the insanely invasive surveillance of citizens that we're seeing in all global communications. And it can also be through the attempted destruction of the World Wide Web as we know it today. It's part of the same violent reaction. And Mika talks a lot about the need for campaign reform in the United States, about changing how money works in politics, because it's part of the structure that makes politics tick. But I think we also need to address things like police violence, because even in the most advanced democracies, it's completely acceptable somehow for police to beat peaceful protesters bloody when all they're trying to do is improve their societies. If that's not a flaw of democracy, I don't know what is. So there's got to be a different way for government to absorb the critique of citizens that doesn't lead to death and destruction. The hacker group Anonymous fought back against tyranny. Julian Assange did, Chelsea Manning did, Edward Snowden did. There are a lot of martyrs in the digital fight as well. So what do we do? In these uprisings and revolutions that we've seen in the past couple of years, a lot of citizens have made alliances with extremists or people who are willing to die and fight back violently against tyranny in the streets. And they've won short-lived battles, but I think in many cases they've lost as much as they've gained. I think in this moment of history, it's part of testing, trying, and learning what works. And I don't know how we're going to change the entire system of democracy and politics. But I think we will achieve more systemic change when we discover even more ways, even more new avenues for peaceful alliances of holding power accountable. And maybe this is the kind of thing that Mika refers to as go. I think people working and campaigning in the digital sphere need to be more conscious of themselves as belonging to a global movement, even when they're working on local issues. And I think we need to be very clear about articulating the problems as well as the solutions and sharing them across borders. There's the architecture and politics of the internet, there's the right to privacy and free speech, and there's the right to transparency and these kind of things. With all our efforts, I think gradually things do change. We shouldn't be complacent, but we should keep faith that change will come when we keep working at it. Before Africa had cell phones, people used to think that poor countries had to go through the same stages of development that the rich countries went through. That first they would have landlines, and then they would get cell phones, and then maybe they would get internet. In reality, a lot of poor countries have just skipped ahead to the next stage, using cell phones in far more sophisticated ways than they do in the United States or in many European countries. I think globally we see these kinds of leaps in civil society and in politics as well. Online civil society doesn't care where innovations come from or who first proposed them. I think Mika is disappointed with the internet's effect on politics, but he's focused on electoral politics in one country with huge interest groups where the citizenship still believes in hypocrisies like the US being the greatest democracy in the world. Obama disbanded his social movement because it wasn't in his government's interest once he was in power. They saw the power of it, and the fact that they destroyed it could be a validation of its capacity for creating change. Instead, Americans were given a petition website with a promise that maybe the president would look at their signatures. I never believe that there is gold at the end of the rainbow, by which I mean that there's no such thing as a perfect society. And we're never going to be rid of ignorance or greed or hatred in the world. But I know we need to fight for the internet. We need to fight for our rights to use it the way that we have been to improve life and democracy for everybody. Thanks.